and forensic.
Good evening, this is Brass Tacks. I'm Zakka. Jacob. Prime Minister Modi will be in the United States for the next 3 days. Among his big meetings will be the first bilateral meeting with US President Joe Biden, and perhaps more importantly, the first ever in-person Quad summit. Now, with last week's announcement of AUKUS, Australia, United Kingdom, and the United States and Australia being given nuclear-powered submarines, is Quad going to be overshadowed by AUKUS? Is Quad going to be limited to just climate change and vaccine diplomacy? Can China be countered that way? That's what we'll focus on, but first, the story so far.
The United States will compete and will compete vigorously.
As US President Joe Biden continues to battle criticism over the botched-up Afghanistan pullout, the focus will now be shifted to China.
This is the first plurilateral engagement of President Biden. It signaled the priority that his administration accorded to the Quad, and it was also the first meeting of Quad leaders, albeit virtually. We see the Quad as a partnership among 4 like-minded countries in the pursuit of common interests, in striving for a free, open and inclusive Indo-Pacific region.
The Quad is back for the second time in 6 months. The leaders of the 4 nations, US, Japan, Australia and India, will be meeting to discuss the Indo-Pacific. In other words, how to counter China, though there is still hesitation in putting it as it is.
From the Quad perspective, the Quad, as I said, is a diplomatic network. It's not aimed at any one country. In fact, its vision is pan-regional, if you like.
India and Australia held their first 2+2 dialogue, the focus again being China's maritime aggression.
बाइलेटरल और मल्टीलेटरल इंगेजमेंट्स में ज्वाइंट एक्सरसाइजेज से हमारी आर्म्ड फोर्सेस की कॉम्प्लेक्सिटी और सिनर्जी में भी काफ़ी वृद्धि हुई है. हम आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस, अनमैन्ड व्हीकल्स और अन्य विशिष्ट टेक्नोलॉजी सहित रक्षा उद्योग में सहयोग के लिए भी नए क्षेत्रों को एक्सप्लोर करने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं.
On the other hand, the US is also trying to corner China with a new military alliance with Australia and UK called the AUKUS.
A new enhanced trilateral security partnership between Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States. AUKUS.
And America is not the only country. Much has changed for the other 3 players in the Quad as well over the last decade as far as their relationship with China is concerned. And since the last 1 decade, when the idea of Quad was not well explored by any of the 4 players, Quad now finds new resonance and greater push because of the Chinese aggression. But it is clear that it's America that for now is leading the way in this battle. In Washington, D.C., this is Maha Siddiqui for CNN News 18.
All right, let me go across to Maha Siddiqui, who's joining us live from Washington, D.C., our foreign affairs editor, who will be there with you here on CNN News 18 over the next 3 days. This first in-person Quad summit, we had the Foreign Secretary yesterday, and he was specifically asked, will AUKUS in any way overshadow the Quad? And he said, AUKUS has nothing to do with us. It has no relevance for us. But what's the word that you're picking from there? Because at the end of the day, the elephant in the room, or may I say the dragon in the room, is China. Will Quad be satisfied just talking about climate change and vaccine diplomacy and what have you?
No, certainly China is going to be the focus, and a free, open, inclusive, rules-based Indo-Pacific is going to be underlined yet again in the Quad summit. However, Zakka, there is some amount of hesitance that we see still, at least in 2 of the players in Quad, be it India or Australia. Both of them are cautious about openly naming China as the main reason for the coming together of these 4 countries. Remember, the idea of the Quad was floated in 2007, but for a decade it was dormant. to only be revived in 2070. And that is because a lot changed, as I just pointed out in that package there, over 1 decade, when we have seen China's relationship change with these countries. Look at Australia, for instance. China is Australia's largest trading partner. But China has responded very sharply to Australia after it raised the issue of the origin of the coronavirus in the World Health Organization, so much so that there was a dip that was seen last year between the trading partners, a 3% dip there for Australia. Australia continues to say that they want to engage constructively with China. As far as India is concerned, India has its issues with China and its territorial aggression. We are seeing a situation for 1 year now at the line of actual control, and the resolution on these friction points is going very slowly. So things have changed drastically, and that is why China is the focal point of the Quad. This is not a military alliance, so other ways and means are looked at to counter China, and that is why we saw that in the virtual summit of the Quad that was held earlier this year, we looked at how these 4 countries would counter China's vaccine diplomacy by manufacturing Johnson & Johnson vaccines in India's biological E for distribution in Indo-Pacific, 1 billion doses by the year 2022. So other ways and means are looked at by Quad because it's not a military alliance. AUKUS, on the other hand, is a military alliance that has come about. So the idea is to, as far as America is concerned, to counter China through various means. And in that context, many experts believe that AUKUS can be complementary to Quad.
All right, Maha Siddiqui will be in touch with you through the course of the next 3 days as the Prime Minister has a busy 3 days of engagements there in Washington, D.C. first, and then eventually in New York at the UN General Assembly. Let me bring in our guest. Professor Scott Lucas is an international affairs expert, Professor Emeritus at the University of Birmingham. Praveen Swami is Group Consulting Editor with Network 18. We'll also be joined by Casey Singh, former diplomat, and Lisa Curtis as well. Praveen, I'll start with you. Here's where the problem is. After the announcement of AUKUS and after the announcement that Australia will be given nuclear-powered submarines, I think there is a very, very clear onus now on Quad to define itself. If Blinken says it's not a military alliance, yesterday Harsh Shringla was asked, does AUKUS have any bearing on you? And he says it has no relevance for us. So if it is going to be just dealing with climate change and vaccine diplomacy, let's spell that out. Let's then not make countering China as the focal point or the raison d'etre of the Quad as it was envisioned when Shinzo Abe thought of it, 10 years ago, 13 years ago?
Absolutely right, Zakka. There is a certain lack of clarity and has been at the heart of the whole Quad project. Let's not forget also that the concerns of the Quad partners are somewhat different. A free and open Indo-Pacific is a fantastic thing for India, but India's primary concerns are its land borders on the Himalayas, not the Indian Ocean. Similarly, it's this stuff about vaccine diplomacy and climate change are again sort of good things. Nobody will dispute that. But there isn't necessarily a convergence of interest. For example, on vaccines, India has a gargantuan domestic population it needs to address before it reaches out to the rest of the world. So lots of complexities there which haven't quite been worked through. I just add that even with AUKUS, this is much the same case. We don't actually have a treaty text yet. So we don't know exactly what it envisages. But remember, all 3 of these countries are already treaty partners, mutual defense treaty partners of each other. So it's not entirely certain beyond, technological collaboration, which they already have and are all members of Five Eyes. What exactly new this brings to the table?
I think one important thing, of course, is this whole announcement of nuclear-powered submarines for Australia and the fact that British submarines can now have a base in Australia. I guess it sends a signal to Beijing that you're not going to have a free run in the South and East China Seas, or maybe the next time you think of a free run, the rules of the game have changed a bit. But I want to go to Lisa Curtis and ask her, now that this AUKUS announcement came just last week, and this week we have the Quad, does AUKUS sort of overshadow the Quad in a way that, like I just outlined? I mean, if the reason for existence for these two groupings is how to contain or how to counter a hegemonic China, you can't do it through tackling climate change and vaccine diplomacy and great statements about free and open Indo-Pacific. It has to come down to how are you going to convince the Chinese that the cost of bullying smaller countries, whether it's Philippines or Vietnam or other smaller countries, the cost is too high to pay?
Well, I don't think AUKUS overshadows the Quad. The Quad is a very important grouping. In fact, the fact that we're going to see the first ever in-person Quad summit at the White House on Friday demonstrates that the Biden administration sees the Quad as the central pillar to its Indo-Pacific strategy. And when we talk about the Quad asserting a free and open vision for the Indo-Pacific, that really is pushing back against China's increased assertiveness in the East and South China Seas. And just because the Quad is focused on things like vaccine production and distribution, emerging and critical technologies, climate change cooperation, that doesn't mean that these four countries don't have security on their minds. They certainly do. And I think that we should see the Quad and its focus on these softer issues as really building up the organization's ability to push back against a rising China, to be able to compete effectively with a rising China, and to be able to shape the future of the Indo-Pacific in a way that tilts toward democratic governance, openness, transparency, rather than China's ability to promote a more closed, authoritarian order. So I think both the AUKUS initiative, very important, but the Quad initiative and its focus on these softer issues and sort of competing more effectively with China and pushing back against its assertiveness is very important.
If I may, I mean, you're not going to beat China with soft power. I think at least that much should have been clear to us by now over the last 4 or 5 years or so with its assertive behavior. I'm all for the language and the pushback that you spoke about when 4 big countries in the Indo-Pacific say we're all for a free, open Indo-Pacific. Yes, that's a great thing. But Casey's saying if you're in Beijing and you're looking at these 4 countries, these are mere words in a joint statement. How are these 4 countries going to enforce it? I tell you what can possibly enforce it. That's a nuclear-powered submarine. That is something that Beijing is going to think hard about.
Well, look at it this way. These are overlapping combinations of countries. Quad has no older provenance, started in 2007, then revived again when Abe came in. So that is, let's put it this way, that is essentially a multifaceted kind of grouping, which has a lot of soft power democracy, which frightens China, and that was their objection in 2007, because they realized they're going to get excluded. So it's essentially an alliance with those values with a military adjunct, which means you'll be doing Malabar exercise, you have ways of your navies functioning together, and so on and so forth. Whereas the US, UK, and Australia, already alliance partners, they have much closer cooperation they've had in the past. And if you're going to be giving nuclear submarine to Australia, that sends an entirely different signal. And Australians may well give a base to the Americans. Yep. No, India is not going to give a base to the Americans. So you'll have 2 different kinds of groupings. From China's point of view, these are functioning in combination with each other. Some using soft power, some using some elements of a military combination, and some directly military, which is what the AUKUS is. So this doesn't give any comfort to Beijing, because they realize ultimately they're all working together. US is the one that combines them both. So there may be more of these coming up. US has been working on Indonesia. So you may have the comfort levels of each country. Like we would not want that close a military relationship as Australia may be willing to have.
Which is fair enough.
Or an intelligence relationship they have.
No, which is fair enough. Again, I take the example of Japan. Japan is bound by treaty. In fact, the U.S. is bound by treaty to defend Japan if it is attacked or if its interests or assets are attacked. We don't have that kind of a treaty-bound relationship with the United States. I understand that. But Professor Scott Lucas, hypothetically, right? Again, I'm just saying if this were to happen, and we have seen stuff like this happen in the last few years with what the Chinese have been doing in the South China Sea, the bombers that they're flying across the Taiwan Straits virtually on a fortnightly basis. If hypothetically a Sri Lankan vessel were to be attacked or something were to happen in the Indian Ocean region and some of these smaller countries turn to India, wouldn't India be better off if it had the umbrella of Quad countries to stand up to China? Because China is going to look at this Quad country, this Quad grouping, and say, oh, they've got 4 buckets. They've got climate change, they've got vaccine diplomacy, they've got public health, and they've got something else. Nothing that we should be overtly worried about.
Well, I think that's a question which is be put to Indian policymakers. But as an analyst, there is a question, as your other contributors are talking about, which is different visions of what the Quad is. Now, for the Biden administration, the idea of the Quad, as well as other alliances, and Joe Biden set this out yesterday, is that you compete with China, you compete with Russia on a military basis, but you also compete with it in terms of economics and development. In other words, you're a counter to the China Belt and Road Initiative. But here's the issue that I think, and I'd be interested in feedback on this, is other countries are in different positions. So India, for example, is part of the Quad, has received significant military benefits in transfer of technology linked to the Quad. But economically, India is also part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which just met this past week.
Yep.
And of course, the key power in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is China. Add to that the fact that you've got specific issues, such as the border clashes between India and China in recent years. And is India in a position where it has to think about keeping a foot in both camps for economic and political reasons? Or does it follow the US, as I think Australia is doing, which is we're siding with you. We're siding with you. And if that cost us relationship with Beijing, so be it. I think it's an extremely tricky position for India right now to play in terms of its future beyond this Biden administration, and let's say for the next decade in the Indo-Pacific region.
No, so I think that's a great point that Professor Scott Lucas makes. On the face of it, it appears contradictory, Praveen, that how is it that India is part of the Quad grouping of nations, which ostensibly, they're not saying it in as many words, but everybody knows the elephant in the room is China. It is meant to counter China in some form. You can call it, the economic/infrastructure bucket, maybe not so much the military bucket. And yet, at the same time, India is also part of groupings like the SCO or BRICS. At some point, this contradiction is going to flare up.
Possibly, but remember, this is indeed true of India. India has a number of relationships with countries or alliances of countries that don't get along, but exactly the same is true of the United States. India has the United States has a strategic relationship with India, for example, but it also has a strategic relationship with Pakistan. I think this is in the nature of a world that is confused and muddy. And I think, as the professor just said, it's entirely correct that most countries will try and hedge their bets, try and see what possibilities or what opportunities might be available from overlapping alliances. And India's most fundamental reality, as I said earlier, is that unlike other members of the Quad, it does not have the luxury of merely signaling or working to keep the Indo-Pacific open. Whatever it does will have consequences for it on its land borders. And that is going to be foremost among Indian calculations. Another consideration and worry is going to be what happens in India's western neighborhood, because the east is not the only troubled border India has. And the United States withdrawal from Afghanistan is likely going to set in place a chain of events that will absorb at least some of India's energy. So it's going to be a complicated time. This will obviously have implications for the Quad and how India relates to it going forward.
Okay, I want to go back to Lisa Curtis and taking off from what Praveen was saying. While the focus will be on the East, which is the Quad, and what to do in the South and East China Seas, clearly they will also be talking about what's been happening towards India's West, which is Afghanistan, and this really botched up exit plan that the Biden administration came up with. And again, I'm going back to how this is going to be viewed in Beijing. They're going to look at it and say, America, the world's foremost superpower, a war that lasted 20 years, I don't know how many $1 trillion, and they couldn't win. They had to retreat. So wouldn't Beijing be emboldened further when it comes to Taiwan, or when it comes to what it feels its interests are in the South and East China Seas?
Well, I think this will be a key topic during Prime Minister Modi's bilateral meeting with President Biden. I expect that Prime Minister Modi will make the point to President Biden that India is very concerned about terrorist rebuilding in Afghanistan now that the Taliban has taken over. And I would expect that Modi would try to convince President Biden that the United States should not take its eyes off Afghanistan, that even though there are no longer U.S. troops in the country, that the U.S. must remain engaged in the fight against terrorism, keeping counterterrorism capabilities in the region to be able to deal with rising threats. So I would expect Modi to raise that, and he may even at least hint at the point that to the extent that terrorists rebuild in Afghanistan and start to threaten India's interest directly, because Pakistan will, of course, be more powerful in the region, that will take away attention for India to be able to give the challenges in the East. Yeah. So I think this point will likely be made. And I just want to raise also India's reasoning for remaining engaged with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is also driven by its concerns about Afghanistan and its recognition that the regional states, the Central Asian states, as well as China and Russia and Iran, are going to be playing bigger roles in Afghanistan. So India simply has no choice but to coordinate with these various countries and see how it can meet its own interests.
Casey Singh, again, taking off from what both Lisa Curtis and Praveen Swami said, given the events that have happened in Afghanistan, do you think India's energies, its resources, a bulk of its time will be spent trying to address this emerging axis of China, Pakistan, Taliban, and what that may mean for India and India's interests, in a way that it won't be able to devote as much energies to what's happening in the East? That the more India gets sort of associated with the Quad or other Eastern groupings, Beijing would sort of turn the pressure tap, as it were, on the West. And that's a very easy, cost-effective way of turning up the tap for them.
Well, this dissonance is there between working closely with the U.S. in the Indo-Pacific and the Americans leaving behind this destabilized Afghanistan. That's why you would have seen the Indian statement before Prime Minister left, talked of Afghanistan as one of the subjects that was going to be discussed. And I tweeted in the morning, I said, no, that is of no interest to U.S. in the Quad format. And as Lisa said, they'll probably be brought up in the bilateral format, to which the Americans will listen carefully. But do remember, just last week in their House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee meeting, where Secretary of State Blinken went for the first time after their withdrawal, there was a very serious attack on Pakistan. There was a demand that there should be an examine, and Blinken had to concede that they'll inquire into the last 20 years to see how Pakistan's duplicitous behavior has affected them. There were demands for sanctions against Pakistan. Now, that may be just a demand. I don't think Americans have always been transactional. They like to keep a door open. But I think we have to push that and say you should stop getting defrauded by this double-faced entity, and therefore please exert more pressure. Now, as far as the Shanghai Cooperation is concerned, the Iranians have just joined it. And that does not have an economic dimension. It only has a security dimension. And there, I think the Russians and the Indians have a shared interest to make the Chinese understand they're just being friendly with Pakistan is not necessarily going to serve their interests. If that will destabilize Afghanistan, it'll impact Central Asia and the entire Belt and Road Initiative, which runs through it. So even the Chinese will have a conflicted sort of approach to it. You want to work through the Pakistanis, but you don't want to destabilize Central Asia because that then upends all your Belt and Road initiative.
I'll give the final word to Professor Scott Lucas. We are expecting, we don't know at the end of the Quad meeting what's going to be announced, but we are expecting some kind of a big infrastructure announcement. Again, it's going to be viewed in Beijing as some kind of a counter to BRI. And yet, what Casey Singh alluded to, this contradiction, does China persist with the BRI through Pakistan with its inherent destabilizing factors very much intact? Or does it bring on board the concerns raised by other countries like Russia or Iran or India for that matter? How will this be again viewed in Beijing? It'll be straight up seen as a counter infrastructure push to what they're trying to do with the Belt and Road.
Yes, but China's expecting that. I mean, it's not just a question of what we get from the Quad. Look at the European Union's announcement last week of the Global Gateway, which again links development, investment, and trade as an implicit alternative to BRI. China knows that the main frame right here, as much as we talk about a possible military confrontation in the South China Sea, this is an economic competition for them. This is an economic competition to win over and to link other countries into their alternative economic system. So for that reason, I think what you're going to see is India has this key position here. India has an economic position in both camps. They've got it in the U.S., Australian, Pacific system, and they've got it with China. Now, can they finesse that? Can they get an economic advantage by being in both camps, or do they get caught in the middle and squeezed out?
Okay, we've got 2 feet on 2 different boats. We'll see if we can actually swim against the tides or whether we'll drown in it. But thanks very much for joining us, Casey Singh, Lisa Curtis, Praveen Swami, and Professor Scott Lucas for joining us. That's a wrap. But on the other side, a special show live from Washington, D.C. with my colleague Maha Siddiqui, talking about all of these issues and what's on the agenda when Modi meets Biden in a day or so.